Hello YouTube, Top Hat Gaming Man here. I have noticed on the internet there are constant trends, and one of those current trends on YouTube is nobody will bloody shut up about that NES Mini Nintendo have just released. People are talking about whether it's good, whether it's worth the money, how it's being scalped, blah 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 blah. Everyone's talking about exactly the same thing because that's a bloody trend after all. That's how these idiots are getting their hits. Well, you see, I want to talk about the system from a slightly different angle. I want to look at it as a cynical British man. Yeah! Since I've been travelling the United States, I have noticed how much these Americans love the NES. They like to see it as the be-all and end-all of gaming. And why shouldn't they? According to them, it saved the whole entire bloody video game industry. Which I suppose is true in North America. But for the rest of the world, that is basically far from the case. Saying that NES saved the video game industry is a ridiculous statement to make. It would be like me essentially saying the Sinclair Spectrum was the best-selling gaming platform of the 1980s. See how ridiculous that sounds? It just sounds like nonsense, doesn't it? But it's true in a way. The ZX Spectrum was the best-selling gaming platform in the 1980s in the United Kingdom. See, I had to add that little tiny bit on to make that statement make sense. It's exactly the same about that statement regarding the NES. The NES saved the video game industry in the United States. Do you see what I mean? It's one of those annoying things which is usual Americans blow completely out of proportion. It's one of those ridiculous things. Like, have you heard they've got this sport over here, it's called baseball, and their main tournament they refer to as the World Series. And get this, it only features teams from North America. So there'd be a couple of teams from Canada, mainly teams from the United States, and they refer to it as a World Series. Like, how ridiculous is that? Like, imagine if the Football World Cup only had teams from Europe in. That'd be mental, wouldn't it? Even though most of the good club teams do actually come from Europe. They do have a European Club Cup, which they refer to as the Champions League or the European Cup, but you'd never go as far to say it's as a World Cup. That's just ridiculous, isn't it? It's the same, we go back to gaming again. Apparently, back in the day regarding the NES, they held a tournament here. We all know of the Nintendo World Championship cartridge, but a ridiculous thing regarding that, the Nintendo World Championship only featured players from America. So it wasn't a World Championship whatsoever, it was just the regional championship. This is what I was saying in my Q&A video the other week about the ridiculous exaggerated statements in America. Everything's constant hyperbole. It's as if the world doesn't exist outside of this country. That's all well and good. It's fine that they're self-obsessed with their country. But what gets a little bit grating for me is their self-obsession. It actually like rolls out and affects the rest of the world. Like, for example, if you go to a shop in England at the moment, you'll find that the NES Mini is equally as sold out and scalped to buggery that it is in the United States. It makes perfect sense for that to be happening here, because as I said, the NES was a huge deal here. But since then, I've felt basically you've got so many like American YouTubers, like Angry Video Game Nerd, etc. And you've had generation after generation of Brits and other Europeans, etc. Essentially, they've had like an American video game history wrote for themselves, and they essentially see that as the true history, when it was actually so different in Britain. It makes no sense, as I said, for the NES Mini to be selling so well. No one has that nostalgia to reflect on. We go back to the 1980s and hardly anyone had bloody NESs. It was much more likely that someone would have a ZX Spectrum, an Amstrad CPC 464, just like a Commodore, a Master System. There's so many more options people would more likely to have had than an NES. The only reasons I can think for it to have done so well is basically maybe the 64 appears to do pretty well here in England. So I'm still in America. The 64 seems to do pretty well in England, and the SNES started getting quite popular after the release of Street Fighter. But the NES, it just didn't sell well. I'll give you an example how I got an NES, for example. We go back, I had an Amstrad CPC 464 for the duration of the 1980s. Then I later got my own hands on one. Basically, I got my own off a local scumbag reseller after playing my uncle's SNES and playing Street Fighter and really enjoying it. My parents had already bought me my own SNES, but I wasn't set to get that until Christmas later that year. But we did get me an NES off a local reseller. Basically back then, well, we won't say back then, we say now, all the scumbags are mainly on Facebook groups. You'll see them selling all their baby clothes and other wares. It's nonsense. But basically we had this really poor person who lived on our street. She was a single mother, had like 5 bloody kids. And there was no Facebook back then for her to sell all her crap. So instead she had to knock on everyone's doors in the street and show everyone what she had. And one week she happened to have an NES, so I spotted it and I saw like Mario, Donkey Kong, etc. And I said, Mum, I want that. So obviously it was mine. With regards to that, I didn't even know a bloody NES existed. I think very few did. I think most people's introduction to Nintendo in the United Kingdom back then would have simply been by watching the Super Mario Bros. Series and the Zelda series via cartoons. I think that's all we would have known about it. So everyone's going mental for this NES Mini, but there is no chance it could be nostalgia in the United Kingdom because there's no one to be nostalgic about it. I had one, but I didn't get mine until I think about 1993, 1994, and I only got one to hold me over until I got my own SNES. Like, I don't actually know anyone who had an NES. Obviously there were people who had NESs, but they was in the minority. If this was a nostalgia thing, people would have been going mental for the Spectrum Vega that was released last year. To be fair, the Spectrum Vega seems like a better quality product in general. This NES Mini is locked to only play 60 games, a lot of which was never released in Europe bloody anyway. It's absolutely ridiculous. The Spectrum Vega, on the other hand, has 1,000 games preloaded to it. That's more games than what are in the bloody NES's entire library. So you've got your 1,000 games preloaded to it, and on top of that there is another 21,000 games that were released, which you can download to the system as ROMs. That's bloody good value for money. After speaking to a few people on Twitter, their conclusion regarding it says, why would we buy the Spectrum Vega for? There's bloody text games on it and it hasn't got a keyboard, so we can't play them. Dahoy? Yeah, fair enough, but you've still got a lot more bloody content on it, 1,000 games, than you have on an NES Mini, so therefore the Spectrum Vega still wins. I suppose Nintendo are very good at reminding people about the company's history. For example, throughout the Smash Brothers games, they've like released those trophies, and they're often flashback to like previous games within their history. So if you're like, I don't know, like a youngster who started with the bloody GameCube, you would have learnt about some of the NES history simply by playing Smash Brothers. So I wonder whether that's the reason why people are going for the NES in Europe, is because of basically revisionist history, you see. So to summarise, it seems completely impossible that the sales of the NES Mini could be driven by nostalgia at home. That just seems absolutely impossible. The only conclusion I can draw upon is, like I said, people have watched loads and loads of bloody YouTube over the years and been influenced by people like the Angry Video Game Nerd into giving the NES a try. Like I said, it's an absolutely amazing system. There's no question about that. But I don't want any of you at home bloody trying to tell me you're buying it for nostalgia purposes. That's a complete bloody lie, and you know it. You didn't grow up with an NES. Apart from that, obviously I know one or two of you would have grown up with an NES, but that just brings it to my next point. Now I would like all of you in the comments section who grew up in the 1980s to tell me what platform you grew up with and what one you gamed on. Apart from that, I'd also like to know which country you are from. So, what country you're from, the console you grew up on, and when. So we'll let the youngsters get involved in this one as well. Yeah. Well, that's what I've got to say about the NES Mini. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comment section, and we'll have a bloody good discussion which will probably turn into an argument between all of us. Cheerio!